useful reminder. Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay, great. And
Yeah, so I just wanted to start with a couple of expectations just to make sure that we all can get the most out of this workshop. So this will be an interactive workshop. So it will be really great if you're all fully present with us, minimize the distractions around you, really participate. There's a couple of like those breakouts where we hope to learn from each other. We really hope you will speak up. And if you don't, we are going to count that as an agreement. I also really appreciate just seeing each other's faces. I think there's a lot of people that I don't necessarily know here. So seeing your face and getting to know you would be great. I know sometimes some people have like some things in the background, kids, dogs, etc. So if you have such things, please mute yourself. We would also love to get to know you. So when you speak up, please identify yourself. And also please know that Suzanne will be leading this workshop, but Brad and I will be on the background. We will be able to answer many of your questions in the chat and help you out with any things that may come up. So what is this all about? So I think you may have heard already a couple of times, like RCN, which stands for Research Coordination Network, and BII. And BII stands for Biology Integration Institute. And these are institutes that get like a significant amount of funding to bring together larger teams of biologists and other associated disciplines to, address like bigger interdisciplinary teaming questions in biology. There are a couple of BIIs that are really representing the RCN in the core, but everyone else are also helping us to a big extent. So hopefully you're part of one of those, and if not, I think these are really great organizations that you might want to learn more about. So what are we doing for this research coordination network? So our real overall goal is to build a toolkit for you where you can easily get access to how you can best work together as a larger group. One thing is to have like the right governance and infrastructure to work well together. The second, which is what we're going to talk about today, is really about data management. How can we make sure that we manage data well for ourselves, but also in a way that we can easily share it with each other? Then we do team science, which is like my expertise, which is really like how do we train people to work well together and address conflicts and tensions and prevent those. Of course, super important, science communication outreach. How do we do well as mentors and making sure that that we include people, as well as how do we do good evaluations and really use that as a feedback loop to make ourselves better. So our goals is really to get all those documents about how we collect data, how we process it, how we store and share it, and translate that to the people that we work within our BAIs and across BAIs and even beyond that.
all
Suzanne,
right.
back to you.
Thank you, Anne. So now we'll be getting into the meat and potatoes of today's workshop. So as I mentioned, I'm Suzanne. I'm with eMERGE and based at Ohio State University. So why are we doing this workshop? So many of us have been in situations kind of like this where we should have started planning our data management at the beginning of our projects, but didn't, and then keep making temp folders, temp subfolders, and now there are 30 messy temp folders. And then when it's time to do the publication, then there's a scramble to figure out all of like where all our data is so that we don't end up in this situation where we have a publication, but it says data available on request, and then someone requests it and we have to search in our messy files to actually find our data. So today, specific topics we'll cover will be what are called the FAIR principles of data management, metadata, what that is, best practices for formatting tabular data and organizing your files, introduction to databases, and intro to data management plans required by funding agencies. All right, so now we'll have a poll of what types of data do you work with in your research, or do you have to deal with organizing, anything like that? And see, is the poll there? We go. Okay, the poll is now it's within Zoom, and can everyone see it? Okay, great. And I think yeah, you should be able to choose multiple. Looks like so far we have lots of tables of numeric data and time series, sequencing data, text, including freeform text, is pretty well represented. Lots of images. Some model outputs, not that much protected or human subject data, but some. And let's see, we have 26 out of 32 participated. We'll do a last call for more responses. Another 15 seconds to get your responses in if you haven't yet. And I think we're still, oh, okay, the poll's closed anyway, so
Yeah, seems like a
don't-
nice representation of different data.
yeah. Thank you, everyone. Okay. And now we will go into breakout rooms to introduce ourselves to each other. Where we're coming from, what kinds of data we work with, and what we hope to learn.
Sure. So we're pretty diverse in our group, actually. There was human, information from student success to data on time series and climate and maps to model outputs. So that was really, really important. And we didn't catch the last question because it was really quickly in terms of what we were hoping to learn, but we talk about one challenge that is common to all of us, that is like what is supported throughout institutions to store that data, it changes according to institutions what it's paid for and what it's not. So longevity of that data can be challenging if it is not published, right? So that's what we were discussing.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks for sharing. How about room 2, which is Tamar, Don, and Petra?
I can share a little bit from our group. We also had kind of a diversity of people coming from different backgrounds. And I think in general, we're all interested in learning just more like tips and tricks about how to wisely ahead of time sort of organize and store our data. And interestingly too, one of us is also teaching graduate courses and thinking about how she might be able to incorporate some of this into those courses for her students.
Very cool. How about room 3, Jordan, Nick, and Rachel?
I can talk about what we were saying. So I know that I was saying, and a couple of us were saying that it would be good to learn about file naming and organization, just baseline knowing best practices, because then for me at least, I know I'm going to have to be collecting a lot of data this year, so it would be good to kind of have that baseline organization. We also were talking about how some of us are going to have some sequencing data, or we have it, or we're going to have it. And Nick is a data manager and works with sequencing data, and that it can be a little bit like hard to know, I guess. And Nick, you could jump in if I'm explaining what you said incorrectly, but kind of governing other people's data and keeping track of it, especially when it's such dense stuff.
Great.
And we
How
will be
about-
talking about that.
Great. Awesome. How about group 4? Anupa, Laura, Maya. That's a hard name. I'm sorry. And Tanya.
If nobody's there, I can. Okay.
Tanya, go.
Okay, so we had undergraduate to postdoc to faculty, very mix of people, and they are working with a different type of data, like some normal basic data that record from Excel to very sophisticated like evaluation data that another postdoc was using. So everybody liked to learn about the different perspective based on their data and how the basic skill can be applied to different areas. So just a summary, and I'm happy to see that recently undergraduate student who finished undergrad also interested this kind of thing, that starting everything from the fresh, like learning everything from the beginning. I wish I had that.
Yeah, I think it's better to learn early, right? How about Kaylee, Laura, Maggie, Miranda, and Martin?
Yeah, I think generally we agree. We came from a variety of backgrounds, different data sources, which is cool. But we agreed that, we're here to learn anything you guys are ready to throw at us, particularly about data management, storage, and how best to store it in a way where sharing it with teams and other people are effective and it doesn't get complicated and it doesn't change. One person changes one tiny thing and ruins it for the whole thing and potentially for everyone else by accident. And so those types of dilemmas we want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. About Miranda, Meredith, and Stephanie?
I can jump in. Hi, yeah, our group, we had some different data that we were all looking at. I mean, I'm an external evaluator, so I'm looking at human data. And our group was also looking at spectral data and some kind of just like normal numerical data. So the most important thing I think that came out of our group is best practices moving forward. Because Mariana in her group, they're going back and looking years in the past about data and then having some issues about labeling samples, and file names are becoming an issue. And so I think probably starting a best practices, in any lab is probably really important to be able to start now. And that way, when this becomes the past, you're not stuck with not knowing where data is or what it's labeled as. So yeah, and then also human subjects like interviewing, interview data, sorry. And then looking at the open science framework.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're hoping. And then the last group, Jessica, Millicent, Ray, and Hojun.
Yeah, so we had kind of the same consensus as everyone else. We had people from different backgrounds working with different data types, and we all kind of felt like what we're trying to figure out is how to manage like having all of the data in a spot where it's easy to also do analysis at the same time, or just like make it easy to work with one, like with the entire project and not just have the data storage be separate from everything. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Very cool. Back to Suzanne, and hopefully we'll learn a lot more.
All right, thank you everyone for sharing. So hopefully you can see my screen again. So now I'll be going into more detail about some general principles of data management and then even more detailed personal data organization strategies. Okay, so what counts as data? So I looked at various definitions on the web and found, there are a few diverging definitions. So in a most basic sense, data is information, but ideally that information is useful and also easy to be processed digitally. So a figure may technically be data, but it does not fulfill the sharing needs for reproducibility that many journals and funding agencies have. And there's this link, what is data, which will be included in the summary document, which will be shared with you all, that talks about this in more depth. So why does data need to be managed? So talked about this a little bit earlier, but even going beyond your individual projects, as some of you mentioned, different disciplines can use very different data types, from genomic sequencing to remote sensing to gas flux data, which can be, this is just one way of plotting summarized data, and gas production rates from incubation experiments, and of course, whenever there's experimental setups, that introduces infinite layers of complexity, because there's infinite levels of or types of experiments that someone can do. So all of these data types can quickly become disorganized, so it's important to have a strategy for managing them, so both you and other people can make sense of it later. So to kind of describe the principles of data management, Wilkinson et al. Developed the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So in kind of the most basic sense, findable means that the data is easy to find and read, both for humans and computers. Accessible means it's easy to retrieve and open access, not behind paywalls or dead links. Interoperable means that the data uses clear and consistent terminology and references other data as needed, which allows easy integration with other data. And reusable means that the data is well described to enable reproducibility of the analyses, and the license that gets published under also allows this reuse. And many of these qualities actually fulfill multiple principles. So if you read up on them in detail, you'll see a lot of these ideas fulfill, for instance, both findability and interoperability, because consistent terminology allows someone to enter useful keywords and find the data they're looking for. So the first two of these principles, findability and accessibility, ensure data transparency. And this is essential for building and maintaining public trust in science. So we need to remember most of us are working on research projects funded by grants, which are ultimately from taxpayer money. And even though probably the vast majority of people who are not doing science are not going to be specifically looking for data, the ones that do, we want to be able to keep ourselves accountable for the research we've done and to be able to point to our methods and everything that we've done. So some ways to make data more transparent including enough definitions so someone can understand it, and then also sharing it in well-established public repositories, which I will talk about next. So public repositories, these are large databases that are maintained by like large entities that have the resources to maintain these databases long-term for community use. So these are just some examples. Not all of them are huge. Like there's a university database, which from Stockholm University, which nonetheless does have DOIs for its data sets. So a DOI, so that stands for Digital Object Identifier, and that's just the most common example of persistent identifiers. And what these are is they take the place of URLs and often a part of a URL, and they are inherently designed to stay constant even as websites update their domain names. And it's not perfect because the websites still need to update the databases used by these systems, but they are still kind of the best way we have to ensure long-term data preservation, even as projects end their lifespan. Moving on to the last two of the principles, to be interoperable and reusable, data should be annotated as consistently as possible. And this can be challenging when working across disciplines, because as I mentioned, broader scale, more interdisciplinary projects produce larger files, which are more numerous and more varied. Different disciplines can also use different terminologies, even if they're just talking to each other. And there can be multiple levels of data processing representing different information quality, and this also varies across disciplines. So the kind of the tasks of good data management, data sharing, and integration, in one sense, these seem like kind of separate challenges, but they actually feed one another. So data sharing enables cross-project syntheses, and then the results of those syntheses can then be in turn shared again. So all of the FAIR principles really do kind of feed one another. So now I'll briefly talk about metadata, which is the term for data about data, which is used for annotating data sets for interoperability and reusability. So metadata is high-level information about a data set. And so if you have good metadata, this helps a lot with fulfilling the FAIR principles. And metadata can be categorized as file metadata, which is about data sets, things like the title of the data set and the authors, as well as sample metadata, which is kind of more detailed and includes things like site names and sampling dates, where it was collected, things like that. These can overlap, especially in high complexity data sets where each sample has its own file. And in some cases, what are often thought of as simpler data like soil pH can be lumped into metadata when talking about these higher complexity data sets. So for instance, for a genomic, for a metagenomic sequencing data set, where there's many different analyses that can derive from one file, the soil pH of that one sample is often called metadata. So just something to be aware of as you're communicating across disciplines. All right, so I guess do we have time for like very quick 2-minute if anyone has questions so far?
I think we have time for a quick question if anyone has it.
Okay. Open the chat.
Yeah, also if you have a question, like don't hesitate to put them in the chat and we can get to them, you know, maybe directly in the chat, or we can put them to Suzanne later.
I think since I don't see any questions in the chat, I will move on. All right, so now I'll go into kind of some more nitty-gritty details about organizing tabular data. So tabular means in tables or spreadsheets, and some do's and don'ts, because it's a lot easier to format data cleanly from the beginning than to clean up a messy data set later. All right, so here's an example of a data table which looks pretty with different color coding, but it has some problems, which if I received this file, it would make me very grumpy. So yeah, can you spot the issues here, and please enter your responses in the chat if you see anything that looks off, and I will then go through exactly what I see the issues are. I see Nick Hoffman said, shout out to the care principles, which are not related to this, but yeah, that's great for thinking about usability for Indigenous and local communities. So anything that deals with data of human importance. So thank you, Nick. All right, now going into the responses to this prompt. So for this data set, yeah, merge cells, symbols, variables are not organized. Yep, color coding can be lost, can't be read by things like R. Nested tables, sample names, not consistent, mixed variable types. Yeah, looks like you're all very good at spotting a lot of these issues. What year? Yes. All right, so now move on to pointing them out. Yeah, long column names, spaces. Yep. Okay. So now moving on. Yep, as many of you pointed out, the dates are only color codes and they don't include the year. 2-row headers with merged cells can get complicated for reading into scripts. Sample metadata are not consistently formatted, and there's more than one thing included in these strings. Site metadata are in these separate header rows, which get lost if the data is sorted. Average rows are only delineated within sample names. And site level data, in this case, water table depth is only in the first row, even though what I had in mind for this scenario was that they would apply to all rows for that given sample. So that information would be lost for the second replicate of these. And special characters are often lost during file conversions. All right, so these are all kind of some issues in this data set. Issues can also be introduced if you are just tired and making a lot of human error. So to reduce these mistakes, avoid doing complicated manual data entry or cleanups when you're tired, especially if you're working in something like Excel where you can't look back and see what you did. All right, so now this is the same exact data set, which is now reformatted to be a lot more useful. So here you can see that all relevant sample metadata, such as site, depth, replicate, and date, including both month and year, are included. They're consistently formatted, and they're all in their own columns. And there's not any merged cells. This sheet is exportable to a text file without loss of information. And even though in this example, the month color codes are still there for human readability, They are redundant with the text per month, so even if this is exported, the information contained with the color codes is not lost. And this ensures reusability by scripting programs like R. And another thing that makes this better is that the headers now are all, none of them have spaces anymore. All spaces are replaced with underscores, and there's not any special characters. So when you're exporting your spreadsheets to text files, generally one table per sheet is best. So don't have nested tables, don't have two tables in different parts of the sheet, but instead separate them into different sheets before exporting. And the format that I recommend is TSV or CSV, which are tab delimited or comma delimited text files, respectively. In this sheet, averages, even though they're still included, because they're in their own column, true or false, it's easy to just filter out all the true values if you're only interested in the raw data. But another way that you could do this would be to put the averages in their own separate sheet. All right, so now I will zoom out a bit and talk about organization of files within folders. Okay, so here's an example of what not to do. Brett very kindly shared a screenshot of his own messy desktop, which has everything from important data files, which are kind of in the middle of everything else. Have to know where they are to find them. 3-year-old tax documents, video game software, all on the same desktop. Oh, reimbursement receipts in there too. So this is yeah, if this was not my own desktop and I was just trying to find something in there, then it would be very hard to find what I was looking for. So instead, what you want to do is use folders, obviously, but also make sure your file naming and organization are consistent. Use clear conventions for naming that can be easily understood by someone unfamiliar. Include all crucial metadata within the file names or contents. So don't, for instance, have files that are not labeled with the year and just put them in folders by year and hope that that's clear, because even though it might be clear within that folder structure, if you then forget that you did that and send your files to someone else, then because they don't see the parent folder, they wouldn't know what the year was. That's why it's important to have that kind of information in the files, not relying on the folder structure. Even though folder structure is great for organizing. Within file names, but also in general, date formats, year, month, day, using 4 digits for year, 2 for month, 2 for date, allows for the files to be sorted by name, and assuming there's not any other obscuring information, the dates will appear in the correct order. And this is also applicable for file contents, by the way. And then lastly, include version identifiers in file names, which can be the dates, but you can also use kind of more formal naming systems, which I will talk about now. So the versioning. So you always want to assume, even if you think you have your final file, that it probably won't be the final one. So your simple final ... can become this really long, messy name as revisions are sent back and forth. This applies not just to documents, but to data files. If you, for instance, discover a mistake or something you could have formatted better. So versioning system that I recommend is called semantic versioning. And this was originally developed for software, but it can also be adapted for data sets. So for software, that you have the this three-part system where kind of the broadest level is first, major, and then intermediate minor revisions, and then patch revisions, which are kind of the smallest, and for software it would be like a bug fix. And then if you're not quite sure if it's like your final version with this number, you can add a suffix like beta. And so this is an example of one of my own file naming structures that include this semantic versioning. So this is the field sheets from the Emerge project, and you can see, even though they are in folders by year, the years are also in the file name. The dates are formatted as I described, without dashes to be short, but you can still tell these are like the so in this case, the 2022-01-04, that's the date in which I downloaded this file. And that's because it was originally a Google sheet, which people were collaboratively editing. So it's very useful to know what date it was downloaded, because people editing it are not like renaming it every time they're revising it. And then after I download it, I do some format cleaning and standardizations, like what I talked about earlier. And then those get formatted and standardized suffixes, and they're exported to CSVs. And this final standardization step is actually done via a script, which I'm sure this probably could be improved. Like for instance, once I create all these, I create a zip file, which if you open it, you can still see the names, but I'm kind of transitioning to also including more information in the zip file name to make it easier to see if you're just looking at it in your system. So this is one example. And so now Brett will talk about a very different example of his own much better file organization structure than that desktop you saw earlier.
Yeah, so I don't actually normally save all my data to my desktop. I do theoretically have an example. And while listening to Suzanne in a lot of the lead up to this workshop, it got me thinking about if I could articulate my own data organizational structures in a way that made sense to other people. So I came up with this graphic here. So I try to save everything starting in my documents folder, with every folder within that documents tab having a distinct project name that I come up with. And within that project name, have a series of nested folders that you can follow with these arrows here to any sort of year of the data or proportion of the project, if there's like a field component and a chemical wet lab component. And then with each of those folders, I really try to store all of my data in a very consistent raw data folder, which never gets touched. Then all your clean data that's used for analysis, that's the only data folder that I will use. And then all the outputs from those analyses are saved independently as well, with regular backups specifically on that raw data, which I try to store in copies that I own, as well as on the cloud, and any sort of outputs as well. I really found this just activity of sketching out my own data storage principles to be quite useful. I found out pretty quickly from looking at Suzanne's that I don't really have a consistent file naming structure. I really only have consistent folder naming structures. So if you want to try this at home, I recommend it, and maybe pass it to a colleague or somebody else, because they will very rapidly point out where the gaps are within your data storage structures, and then that can really help kind of alleviate some burden down the road. All right, back to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Brett. All right, so to kind of sum all this up, when you do all of this data organization well, it allows all these different types of data sets that I shared earlier as figures to be integrated, which allows the exploration of emergent phenomena at the forefront of science. So obviously, when you actually do it, it doesn't actually look like putting a bunch of figures together. It would be kind of the ideally text files, but this is kind of a schematic of what you can do. All right, so now I will be going into some approaches to data storage. All right, so I'm sure many of us have experienced maybe even if your computer didn't catch on fire, maybe your computer crashed and you lost a bunch of your data. So to avoid this kind of thing ruining your entire research project, you want to make sure your data is backed up frequently. So UC San Diego, this link at the bottom suggests having 3 copies, including your working copy, as well as 2 backups, one on the cloud and one on storage media that you own. So you want to have one on the cloud so that if your house burns down and destroys both your computer and your external hard drive, you still have a copy that is out there safe from all that. And the advantage of also having your own storage media is that if there's like a big ransomware attack and all computers connected to the internet experience data losses, then you still have your external hard drive, which is just sitting in your drawer, not connected to the internet, that still has your data on it. This is more than what most people do, but ideally, you definitely want to have at least one backup, ideally both of these in addition to your working copy. So earlier when I talked about sharing your data via public repositories, this helps with long-term persistence of the final versions of data, but you still want to back up the versions that you're using. Another consideration for long-term preservations besides backup are that you want to choose file formats that are commonly used and open source to make sure that others are able to open them without discontinued or proprietary software. So you may have seen file extensions you're not familiar with that you would need like specific like software connected to an instrument to open. So that's not the format you want to save your data in. Also, even with kind of the more common things like Microsoft Word, this cartoon, this Star Trek cartoon is showing how, if you have your, like they had their peace contract file in the in an outdated Word format, and then the Romulans nuked the Federation, and this could have been avoided with just having like a text file or something that was not dependent on some external company updating, breaking changes to their software. Some other considerations, you may want to store a lot of files, and in general, if your files are small, this is good, but not all your files may be used in the future. And so you may need to omit some things, especially if you have very large file sizes. So you want to decide which of your files have long-term reuse value. So some examples are any original files that can't be easily reproduced. And this is kind of regardless of what the format is, even if it's a weird XQZ file from an instrument, you still want to keep them just in case you need to reprocess them later. Of course, because these are often not ideal, you want to also store your processed and format clean versions of files, as well as any scripts or software used for processing or transformation. And often this is not just a one-step process. Often there are multi-steps, but if you have like an intermediate large file that you're not going to use, As long as you store the scripts used to generate that immediate file and then process it, then someone can still reproduce that process even if they don't have all of the large files. You want to also have README files documenting all of these steps. And a README is just a basically text file describing what all the files are and what was done to them. And you can also use tools like GitHub or SnakeMake to not just like document what all the steps were and to make them automatically runnable, which is what SnakeMake does, but also to track changes, which GitHub is really good at. Some other considerations which I didn't mention on here are like what kind of cloud storage you use, and this has a variety of different considerations. So if you're the only one using a given set of files and you have a university storage account, then what happens when you leave that university and no one else can access your files? So if you're especially when you're moving between institutions, if you're part of a large project, you want to make sure your data is stored in a place that is shared so that other people can still find your data files. You can also use third-party cloud storage like Dropbox or Google Drive, as long as everyone involved in the project knows where to find the files. Okay, so now we will have another activity. Anne, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are going to send you out to another breakout room. And what we want you to do as a group is to really discuss the prompts that we have on here. What are the organizational and storage challenges that you have seen in the past? What have you improved after these experiences? How could you apply the FAIR principles that you've just learned? And, what are maybe some of the tips and tricks that are working well? So we will send you into breakout groups, but we also really hope that we can keep track of all of these things for you with a tool that is called Idea Boards. And I'll share the link to that here in the chat. And what Idea Boards does is it gives you these 4 questions, which gives you a little bit of a reference, but it also is really awesome because what we can do is we can have sticky notes with our experiences and our ideas that we can collect as a group. By just clicking on the plus, you will see that there is like a sticky note that will pop up. And you can just click on that sticky note and you can write on that. Another very cool feature of this is like when someone starts writing on these sticky notes, and I'm sure some of us have very similar experiences, is that once the sticky note is posted, you can do a thumbs up. So we also kind of can learn like what are like some of the common problems that many of you have faced. For example, I've had a couple of my computers crashing. I didn't always learn from that, but maybe some of you were better with that. But you can see, you can just add the thumbs up, so we also know like what are common experiences, what are popular ideas that we should really prioritize in our data management. So I see Nick has a really great contribution.
Sorry, that was neither here. I apologize, or bad timing.
No, not at all. And I also just wanted to let you know we are taking some notes and capturing the resources that we're all sharing, so that at the end we can share recording and those notes with everyone so we can learn from each other. That's really like the goal of the workshop, right? So thank you for sharing. So we will send you all out to breakout room, and you all be working on the same idea boards. Like I hope you can capture the things that you learn from each other there, and maybe you feel inspired when someone writes something. It's like, oh yeah, I had that experience too. So Brad, can you
Sure.
I'm
I
gonna
think
send
we'll go
everyone.
for like 20 minutes, 15, 20.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll send you a note before we close the room.
We've mentioned it.
Hi everyone, welcome back.
Hello,
Hello,
everyone.
everyone.
So I see on the idea boards a bunch of things that we have been talking about, but also a bunch of cool things that I think are really interesting. So a lot of people are confused with old data, crashing computers. Raise your hand if you had a crashed computer that lost you data. Okay, quite a few of us. Getting everyone to agree on standards. That's like a practice that I think many people struggle with. I always try to be better, but sometimes that's really hard. The software issue, I see people downloading maybe the numeric data, but not the text version, and all kind of that is, I think, pretty common with social science data. Maintain variable descriptions. I think that's also a thing that a lot of people struggling with. Documenting errors in the data and the fixes. Oh, that's such a good one. I always forget, and sometimes I go back and it's like, oh, what did I do? Yeah, those are really good things to keep in mind and absolutely try not to forget. So what can we do about that? We can back up our data, try to break in dates and specific things that are project specific, store things in the cloud, using the cloud for all the data, pay for a personal cloud system, let members must back up storage devices. I think that's great. Maintain variable descriptions, making naming easy. I also see like a bunch of people are talking about Google Docs and Dropbox. How many of you are using either of those? Yeah, I think that's like a really good solution too. Working on living documents as a team so everyone can work on that together, especially if you can track, like maybe with like history or track and trace, like what has been changed can be super helpful. I see people talking about Dryad and Zenodo. I'm not really familiar with Dryad. Does anyone want to share what that is? How it helps you?
Yeah, I publish a ton in journal society journals that require us to aggregate our data in public repositories. If it is nice, they pay for them too. And it's incredible because they give you a DOI. And when you want to share your data and for reproducibility, you're like, oh, you can just go to Dryad, put the name of the paper, and the data is right there. And Zenodo is the same, but it's just for code, not for data. So you can have a code DOI and a data DOI.
That is awesome. Yeah, great ideas. Let's look into that. And maybe if you can have a link to that in the chat as well, so anyone can access those resources later or look into them, that would be great. Yeah, making subscription-based things available, having a plan for that in the long term, because often, if not, there may be some issues with that as well. I also see some comments about CyberDuck, and I'm not familiar with CyberDuck. Is anyone willing to share what that is and how it's useful to you?
CyberDuck is just for uploading and downloading things from, like, I guess any one place to another, but I use it for servers and cloud databases. So if you have like a terabyte's worth of data and then your computer crashes halfway through, then when it comes back on, it'll tell you exactly how much has been uploaded and how much has not been uploaded, and it'll start where it left off instead of you being like, which half of my data vanished. And I enjoy that.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. README files for data sharing, we shared that. How do you use that? Okay, I see also a couple of other cool Bitbucket and other things. So check out the links that other people are sharing here. So let's go back to Suzanne.
Yes, thank you. And just I want to make another quick note about Zenodo. So, even though it is great for sharing code, and GitHub actually has like built-in integration with Zenodo. So when you put out a code release on GitHub, it automatically gets put to Zenodo. You can also use it for other things, and it's actually what Emerge mainly uses for data sets. And like if you add something, you can select different types, like code and data sets are some of them. There's also, I think, publication, I think document is one of them. And in fact, we like the RCN, the group putting on this workshop series is going to be using Zenodo mainly for publishing tools. So it can be used for all kinds of things, but Dryad is great too. And I think Dryad also, unless they change this, I think they do some kind of review process, which it like ensures better quality, which makes it take a little bit longer to publish stuff, whereas it's immediate with Zenodo. But yeah, all these tools have their different trade-offs, so it's worth looking into them. This is my cat. Hasina. All right. Okay. I will now move on. All right, so now I'll talk a little bit about databases. We might go into them in more depth in a future workshop, but just to kind of give an overview. So contrary to the way some people use the word database, a database is not just a set of files or a project folder. It's also not a really big spreadsheet, but it's more kind of formally defined than that. So a database houses data within a unified structure with varying degrees and types of metadata standardization. And I'll talk about those different types in the next couple slides. But building a database, like because it is kind of this structured thing, it does require planning and work. But if you have a large project, then it can be a worthwhile thing to do. So databases are kind of a broad catch-all term, which include anything all the way from public data repositories like Dryad and Zenodo down to project databases, which can be more customized for like a smaller project, and personal databases, which depending on what your research is about, you might find it makes sense to build a database just for your own part of your research. So three common broad database types are file repositories, relational databases, and graph databases. So a file repository is just, it's close to being a set of files, but rather than just being a bunch of files in a folder, these files have structured metadata. And this is specifically file metadata. So things like they all have titles, they all have authors, and so on. And these are designed to allow easy addition of new data sets. And because of that, many public repositories like Zenodo use this design. There's also integrative databases, of which relational and graph databases are two different types. And they mainly differ kind of under the hood and how they're built. So a relational database is a table, set of tables interrelated with keys. And a graph database is a network of nodes and edges. And both of these focus on integrating data with a focus on sample metadata. And so they're useful for large project databases. They each have different pros and cons. So generally a graph database is more flexible than a relational database, because you can build kind of any network structure you want. So this is great for if you might be adding new data sets that you don't know yet exactly what they look like, but it also means that you have to be more proactive about making sure all your sample metadata is consistent. Whereas a relational database relies more on these predefined attributes for building these keys linking to tables, which is good if you already know in advance what all your data is going to look like and you don't want to make it too easy to deviate from that. Graph databases are faster to query than relational databases, but relational databases seem to be more common, at least for these kind of single purpose systems. So now, very brief overview of data management plans. So we will also be talking about this more in future workshops, but basically what it is it's a document which is a required component of proposals for almost all, if not all, US funding agencies. And the purpose is to describe your plan strategies for data management kind of at a high level. So it might include things like which public repositories you plan to share your data to, what broad types of data you're planning to generate, and how you plan on curating and preserving it before it's shared, or in addition to the data you're sharing more broadly. So maybe not so much things like how your data tables are structured, although just if you have a set of definitions that you're using, then that's the kind of thing that you would still mention in a data management plan. So we will be talking about those more later. And oh yeah, and then the other thing is, the other part of a data management plan, which is common, is ensuring accountability. So that's like describing who's responsible for different aspects of implementing the data management plan, and then what your plans after the award ends for preserving data. All right, so now here's some links to some useful resources, and these will all be shared, and I will also likely be adding to this list after this Zoom meeting is over. You can look those over later. And so now we will have a final share out in a chat of what did you learn today and what will you apply to your research. And this is also a chance, if you have final questions, you can also put those in the chat.
Let's take a minute to write down your thoughts, and then we can do a chat waterfall. So when I say go, we can just share everything all together.
Subject of DMPs, who owns the data that a BII produces? So I think there might be some flexibility in how that's defined, but usually it would be the BII and or the data authors. It also, to some degree, it might depend on how it's shared. Like, I know some journals, when you publish articles with them, the journal might own the copyrights to like the typeset article, but not the like the not yet formatted version. And the same might apply to data sets, but it might also vary by journal. But usually it would be the authors, usually not NSF. universities sometimes, especially with code, they might want to kind of take control of it, but that's kind of a controversial thing. But usually with data sets, that's not an issue.
Yeah. So please share all your comments in the chat when you're ready to share now. I also just wanted to highlight that we would love your feedback and just to hear how we did. That's always very important to improve what we're doing, but also to report back to NSF that, you know, that we award taxpayers' money. So please also, if you can fill out the feedback form that Brett just shared with us in the chat.
Reading these, Tamir Licha said, I think my best takeaway is that data management strategy should be taken seriously as an experimental method. Yes, I very much agree. Maybe I'm biased, but I agree it's beneficial for everyone to have more focus on it.
Naming files in a proper way, I think that's really important and a thing that I need to keep telling myself. I think we're still missing some messages from people, and we are really curious to, you know, learn from
Start
you.
the conversation early about data management. Yes.
Absolutely.
README guidelines and semantic versioning.
Yeah, these are all great. Don't hesitate to share what you learned in the chat. I think we've only seen like 4 or 5 people. I think we have like over 20 here, so we do love to hear from you. Folder structure, yeah. Brett, can you put the link again in the chat just so that everyone has easy? Oh, you're so bad. Good job. Well, I would like to thank Suzanne for leading and creating this really awesome workshop. I think, at least for me, there's a bunch of things that I know that I need to be reminded of, and a bunch of things that I learned that are new that I'm very excited about. Suzanne, would you like to share a little bit more about what the ideas are for the next 2?
Yeah, so it's sort of still pending because we're hoping that we can invite someone from NSF to talk more about writing a data management plan. We still need to, hear back from them, find out what dates work well and how much they want to say, which affects how much time we have to cover other topics. But I guess something we hope to include, and even if we don't have someone from NSF, we would still like to cover DMPs in more detail. In addition to that, we have larger scale data management, which includes both the technical side with like big data processing and cloud computing and more about databases, but also kind of the more human side of larger scale data management. Like how do you wrangle a large team to all use good data annotation practices so that everyone understands each other's data, which goes into project data policies and governance. And then as a final activity, probably yeah, we don't know yet which of these it's going to be at the end of because we don't know the order yet, but the final activity of the final workshop will be sketching out your own data management strategy and getting feedback from the other participants on things that look good, things that can be improved. So yeah, thank you all for coming here. And if you have any final thoughts, either keep putting them into the chat or Also, feel free to raise your hand if you want to be called on to share verbally with the group. I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see all your faces. Someone, how soon will we get our slides and recording? So, the slides, we can share like in the next day or two, probably today. The recording, I think Brett is handling that.
Yes, I'll get all the recording and materials that were shared in the chat compiled in a nice way, and we'll say maybe available by Monday. How's that sound? All right. And thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and thank you for participating today.
Good job, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye, Mariana. Enjoy Boston.